Chapter 2 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 7. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 7, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 2, The Lincoln-Seymour Correspondence. Governor Seymour was too thorough a partisan to undergo any change of opinion in consequence of the riotous scenes which had so shaken his own nerves and so frightfully disturbed the peace of New York. On the contrary, he was only the more convinced of the illegality and impolicy of the draft, and at once dispatched Samuel J. Tilden and other prominent citizens to Washington to urge the President to suspend it. He supplemented these personal solicitations by repeated telegrams, asking that the draft be suspended until the President should receive a letter which he was preparing. In this letter, which was dated the 3rd of August, the governor denounced the enrollment and draft as a harsh and unfortunate measure. He claimed that injustice was done in assigning the quotas, that they were not in proportion to the relative population of the several districts, and urged with the greatest earnestness and persistence that the draft should be suspended in the State of New York until measures should be taken by the courts to ascertain its constitutionality, a point which the governor had already decided for himself. He said in this letter that it is believed by at least one half of the people of the loyal States that the Conscription Act is in itself a violation of the supreme constitutional law. And in a tone of sullen menace, he warned the President against persisting in the enforcement of the law. "I do not dwell," he said, "upon what I believe would be the consequence of a violent, harsh policy before the constitutionality of the act is tested. You can scan the immediate future as well as I." He then demanded that the enrolling officers should submit their lists to the State authorities, and that an opportunity should be given him as governor to test the fairness of the proceedings. He left entirely out of view in this letter the fact that he had been repeatedly invited and urged to cooperate with the enrolling officers and thereby ensure the fairness of their action. The tone of this letter was not calculated to inspire the President with confidence in the goodwill or the candor of Governor Seymour, but although he recognized in the governor's attitude that of a determined political opponent, he chose in replying to take his adversary's good faith for granted, and throughout the entire correspondence which ensued, the courtesy as well as the fairness of the President is noticeable. After acknowledging the receipt of Seymour's letter, the President said, "I cannot consent to suspend the draft in New York as you request, because, among other reasons, time is too important." He accepted the figures of the governor as proving the disparity of the quotas in relation to the population. "Much of it, however," he said, "I suppose will be accounted for by the fact that so many more persons fit for soldiers are in the city than are in the country, who have too recently arrived from other parts of the United States and from Europe to be either included in the census of 1860 or to have voted in 1862. Still, he did not insist upon this natural explanation of the disparity, but conceded the governor's claim without further discussion, reducing the quota where it seemed by the governor's showing to be excessive to the average of the districts not complained of. He then said he should direct the draft to proceed in all the districts, ordering a re-enrollment in those whose quota had been reduced. He also promised that the governor should be informed of the time fixed for commencing the draft in each district. He continued, "I do not object to abide a decision of the United States Supreme Court or of the judges thereof on the constitutionality of the draft law. In fact, I should be willing to facilitate the obtaining of it, but I cannot consent to lose the time while it is being obtained. We are contending with an enemy who, as I understand, drives every able-bodied man he can reach into his ranks, very much as a butcher drives bullocks into a slaughter-pen. No time is wasted, no argument is used. This produces an army which will soon turn upon our now victorious soldiers already in the field, if they shall not be sustained by recruits as they should be. It produces an army with a rapidity not to be matched on our side, if we first waste time to re-experiment with the volunteer system, already deemed by Congress, and palpably, in fact, so far exhausted as to be inadequate, and then more time to obtain a court decision as to whether a law is constitutional, which requires a part of those not now in the service to go to the aid of those who are already in it, and still more time to determine with absolute certainty that we get those who are to go in the precisely legal proportion to those who are not to go. My purpose is to be in my action just and constitutional, and yet practical in performing the important duty with which I am charged, of maintaining the unity and the free principles of our common country. But the governor was not in a frame of mind to accept this fair and practical treatment of the subject. Even while the President was writing, the governor was sending him notice of a still more elaborate and partisan statement which had been prepared by his Judge Advocate General, accusing the enrolling officers of shameless frauds, which, he said, will bring disgrace not only upon your administration, but upon the American name. And on the following day, having received the President's letter of the 7th, Governor Seymour wrote again, regretting the President's decision, urging anew the advantages of the system of volunteering over the draft, and calling attention to what he termed the partisan character of the enrollment. He claimed that in 19 Republican districts the quotas were too small, and that in 9 Democratic districts they were too large. You cannot and will not fail, he said, to right these gross wrongs. In spite of these insulting charges, the President did not lose his equanimity and good temper. He did not even suggest, as General Fry does, that the war had then been going on about 2 years, and its early demands had skimmed off the cream of the nation's loyalty, and very naturally most men would be found remaining in those districts which were most unfriendly to the war or the manner in which the government conducted it. He answered with patient courtesy on the 11th of August, saying to the governor that in view of the length of his first statement and the time and care which had been taken in its preparation, he did not doubt that it contained the governor's entire case as he desired to present it. He had answered it, therefore, supposing that he was meeting Governor Seymour's full demand, laying down the principle to which he proposed adhering, which was to proceed with the draft, at the same time employing infallible means to avoid any great wrongs. He therefore arbitrarily reduced the quotas of several additional districts to the minimum heretofore adopted. Although his demands were thus substantially conceded, nothing could mitigate Governor Seymour's hostility to the execution of the law. General Dix, who had been appointed to the command of the Department of the East, with headquarters in New York City, had asked the governor as early as the 30th of July whether the military power of the State might be relied on to enforce the execution of the law in the case of forcible resistance to it. He was anxious, he said, for perfect harmony of action between the Federal and State governments, and if he could feel assured that the governor would see to the faithful enforcement of the law, he would not ask the War Department to put United States troops at his disposal for that purpose. 4 days later he received a reply from the governor saying that he believed the President would take such action as to relieve both of them from the painful questions growing out of an armed enforcement of the conscription law. The general answered in a letter giving expression to his disappointment at the tone of the governor's letter, and receiving no further communication from him, he applied to the Secretary of War on August 14th for a force adequate to maintain public peace. This call was promptly answered, and troops sufficient to preserve public order against any attack were sent him. After the call had been made, the governor informed him that, as there could be no violations of good order which were not infractions of the laws of the State, these laws would be enforced under all circumstances, and that he should take care that all the executive officers of the State should perform their duties vigorously and thoroughly, and that if need be the military power would be called into requisition. And on the 18th of August he issued a proclamation saying that while he believed it would have been a wise and humane policy to procure a judicial decision with regard to the constitutionality of the Conscription Act at an earlier day and by a summary process, that the failure to do this in no degree justified any violent opposition to the act of Congress. He warned all citizens of the State to abstain from riotous proceedings and to rely on the courts for redress of their wrongs. It was probably due to the energetic action of the government, the presence of 10,000 veteran troops from the Army of the Potomac, and the recollection left on the minds of the turbulent classes by the clubs of the policemen a month before, rather than to the half-hearted proclamation of the governor, that when the draft was resumed on the 19th of August no resistance was offered. Governor Seymour, however, continued an active campaign by mail and telegraph against the proceeding, protesting at every stage that the apportionments were unfair, that the demands upon New York were excessive, and the credits allowed the State and city inadequate. The enormous bounties which had been paid by towns and counties proved an irresistible temptation to dishonest men. Almost every criminal out of the penitentiary betook himself to the comparatively safe and lucrative business of bounty jumping. The anxiety for recruits was great, and it was almost impossible to counteract the ingenuity and duplicity of bounty brokers in working rascals into the service. The discipline of the recruiting officers was lax, desertion speedily followed enlistment, and the same nimble rogue might figure under different names in the credits claimed from a dozen districts. This rascality especially flourished in the crowded wards of the city of New York. So fast as enlistments were reported, however informally, from any district, Governor Seymour wanted a corresponding reduction of the quotas, and he also demanded that every New Yorker enlisted in another State should be credited to his own. This last demand was so patently unreasonable that the President refused it, after consulting the Judge Advocate General of the Army. With all reasonable demands for credits, he tried his best to comply. On the 16th of August, he sent the following dispatch to Governor Seymour: "Your dispatch of this morning is just received, and I fear I do not perfectly understand it. My view of the principle is that every soldier obtained voluntarily leaves one less to be obtained by draft. The only difficulty is in applying the principle properly. Looking to time, as heretofore, I am unwilling to give up a drafted man now, even for the certainty, much less for the mere chance, of getting a volunteer hereafter. Again, after the draft in any district, would it not make trouble to take any drafted man out and put a volunteer in, for how shall it be determined which drafted man is to have the privilege of thus going out, to the exclusion of all the others? And even before the draft in any district, the quota must be fixed, and the draft might be postponed indefinitely if every time a volunteer is offered, the officers must stop and reconstruct the quota. At least I fear there might be this difficulty, but at all events let credits for volunteers be given up to the last moment, which will not produce confusion or delay. That the principle of giving credits for volunteers shall be applied by districts seems fair and proper, though I do not know how far by present statistics it is practicable. When for any cause a fair credit is not given at one time, it should be given as soon thereafter as practicable. My purpose is to be just and fair, and yet to not lose time." During the entire summer and autumn, Governor Seymour and his friends made the proceedings of the government in relation to the enrollment law the object of special and vehement attack. On the 17th of October, the President made a call for 300,000 volunteers and at the same time ordered that the draft should be made for all deficiencies which might exist on the 5th of January following, on the quotas assigned to districts by the War Department. Shortly after this, the Democratic State Committee issued a circular making the military administration of the government, and especially the law calling for troops, the object of violent attack, greatly exaggerating the demands of the government, claiming that no credits would be allowed for those who had paid commutation, and basing these charges upon a pretended proclamation of the 27th of October, which had never been issued. The President, with the painstaking care which distinguished him, prepared with his own hand the following contradiction of this misleading circular. The Provost Marshal General has issued no proclamation at all. He has in no form announced anything recently in regard to troops in New York, except in his letter to Governor Seymour of October 21, which has been published in the newspapers of that State. It has not been announced nor decided in any form by the Provost Marshal General or any one else in authority of the government that every citizen who has paid his $300 commutation is liable to be immediately drafted again, or that towns that have just raised the money to pay their quotas will have again to be subject to similar taxation or suffer the operations of the new conscription, nor is it probable that the like of them ever will be announced or decided. The circular we have referred to went on claiming that the State had been thoroughly canvassed and that the victory of the Democratic ticket was assured. But the result showed that the Democratic leaders were as far wrong in their prophecy as in their history. The Republican State ticket was elected by a majority of 30,000 over the Democratic, and the principal State of the Union decided the vehement controversy which had raged all the year between Seymour and Lincoln in favor of the President, a verdict which was repeated in the following year when Governor Seymour was himself a candidate for re-election. In the early part of December, the President, anxious in every way to do justice and to satisfy, if possible, the claims of Governor Seymour, consented to the appointment of a commission to inquire into the whole subject of the enrollment in New York. The principal member of the commission chosen by Governor Seymour was William F. Allen of New York, his intimate friend and an ardent Democrat in politics. Of the other members, General John Love of Indiana was also a Democrat. Chauncey Smith of Massachusetts was a lawyer not prominently identified with either political party. Judge Allen clearly dominated the commission, and they agreed with him in condemning the principle on which the enrollment and draft were conducted. They reported that instead of numbering the men of a given district capable of bearing arms and making that number the basis of the draft, which was the course the enrolling officers, in direct obedience to the law of Congress, had pursued, the quota should be adjusted upon the basis of proportion to the entire population. They did not endorse the injurious attacks made by the governor upon the enrolling officers and agents, but distinctly stated that their fidelity and integrity was unimpeached. The essential point of their report was simply that the quota should be in proportion to the total population of the district and not according to the number of valid men to be found in it. When the President required from the Provost Marshal General his opinion upon the report, General Fry made this reasonable criticism: "The commission has evidently been absorbed by the conviction that the raising of men is, and will necessarily continue to be, equivalent to levying special taxes and raising money, and they would therefore require the same proceeds under the Enrollment Act from a district of rich women which they would from a district with the same number of men of equal means. I assume that we are looking for personal military service from those able to perform it, that we make no calls for volunteers in the sense in which the Commission understands it, but that we assign to the districts under the Enrollment Act fair quotas of the men we have found them to contain." The President entirely agreed with the Provost Marshal General that it was manifestly unjust to require from a district whose young men had been depleted by the patriotic impulse which filled the army at the beginning of the war, as many drafted men as were justly called for from those who had contributed nothing to the field, a course which would have been the logical result of yielding to the demands of Governor Seymour and the recommendation of the Commission. But wishing to make all possible concessions to the State authorities, he resolved once more to reduce the quota of New York, and explained his action in a letter to the Secretary of War dated February 27, 1864. In the correspondence between the Governor of New York and myself last summer, I understood him to complain that the enrollments in several of the districts of that State had been neither accurately nor honestly made, and in view of this, I, for the draft then immediately ensuing, ordered an arbitrary reduction of the quotas in several of the districts wherein they seemed too large, and said, after this drawing, these 4 districts, and also the 17th and 29th, shall be carefully re-enrolled, and if you please, agents of yours may witness every step of the process. In a subsequent letter, I believe some additional districts were put into the list of those to be re-enrolled. My idea was to do the work over according to the law in presence of the complaining party, and thereby to correct anything which might be found amiss. The Commission, whose work I am considering, seem to have proceeded upon a totally different idea. Not going forth to find men at all, they have proceeded altogether upon paper examinations and mental processes. One of their conclusions, as I understand, is that, as the law stands, and attempting to follow it, the enrolling officers could not have made the enrollments much more accurately than they did. The report on this point might be useful to Congress. The Commission conclude that the quotas for the draft should be based upon entire population, and they proceed upon this basis to give a table for the State of New York in which some districts are reduced and some increased. For the now ensuing draft, let the quotas stand as made by the enrolling officers in the districts wherein this table requires them to be increased, and let them be reduced according to the table in the others. This to be no precedent for subsequent action, but as I think this report may, on full consideration, be shown to have much that is valuable in it, I suggest that such consideration be given it, and that it be especially considered whether its suggestions can be conformed to without an alteration of the law. So long as Governor Seymour remained in office, he continued his warfare upon the Enrollment Act and the officers charged with its execution. On the 18th of July, 1864, the President made a third call for troops under the Act, and the Governor promptly renewed his charges and complaints. At this time, however, both he and Mr. Lincoln were candidates before the people, the one for the Presidency and the other for the governorship of New York, and it was probably for this reason that Mr. Seymour's correspondence was carried on at this time with the Secretary of War instead of Mr. Lincoln. But it afforded no new features. There were the same complaints of excessive quotas, of unfair, unequal, and oppressive action as before. He said again that there had been no opportunity given to correct the enrollment, upon which the Provost Marshal General reported that the Governor had been duly informed of the opportunities to make corrections, and that an order had been issued from his own headquarters in reference to the matter. No efforts were spared by the government to ensure a rigid revision of the lists. The Governor spoke with great vehemence of the disparity between the demands made upon New York and Boston, saying that in one of the cities 26% of the population was enrolled, and in the other only 12.5%. General Fry replied to this that the proportion of enrollment to population in Boston was not 12.5, but 16.92%, that less than 17% in New York and Brooklyn were enrolled, and that, in fine, the enrollment was a mere question of fact. It was the ascertainment of a number of men of a certain description in defined areas, that the enrollments were continuously open to revision, and that any name erroneously on them would be stricken off as soon as the error was pointed out to the Board of Enrollment by anybody. He then showed that the quotas throughout New York were in fact smaller than in many other States where the proportion of men was large, and closed his report by saying that he saw no reason why the law should not be applied to New York as well as to the other States. This report Mr. Stanton transmitted to the governor, expressing the somewhat sanguine trust that it would satisfy him that his objections against the quotas assigned to New York were not well founded. He recalled the fact that a commission was appointed the previous year with a view to ascertain whether any mistake or errors had been made by the enrolling officers, but that the commissioners bore their testimony to the fidelity with which the work was done, that with a view to harmony the President had directed a reduction in some districts, but without the increase of others recommended by the commissioners, and that a basis for the assignment being now absolutely fixed by act of Congress, the War Department had no power to change it. In reply to Governor Seymour's demand for the appointment of another commission, the Secretary declined it on these grounds. First, because there is no fault found by you with the enrolling officers, nor any mistake, fraud, or neglect on their part alleged by you requiring investigation by a commission. Second, the errors of the enrollment, if there be any, can readily be corrected by the Board of Enrollment established by law for the correction of the enrollment. Third, the Commission would not have, nor has the Secretary of War or the President, power to change the basis of the draft prescribed by the act of Congress. Fourth, the Commission would operate to postpone the draft and perhaps fatally delay strengthening the armies now in the field, thus aiding the enemy and endangering the national government. The voters of New York in the autumn election decided to retire Governor Seymour to private life, and his successor, Governor Reuben E. Fenton, gave to the government during the rest of the war a hearty and loyal support. The Provost Marshal General, in his final report of March 17, 1866, presents some important considerations concerning the conscription. They are substantially as follows. The conscription was not presented as a popular measure, but as one of absolute necessity. It was difficult to convince the drafted man, whose family depended on him for support, that a law was wise which forced him to enter the military service, or that the Board of Enrollment had not done injustice in refusing to exempt him. The opponents of the measure were prompt to render pretended sympathy and encourage opposition by misrepresenting facts, magnifying real causes of hardship, or creating imaginary grievances where real ones were wanting. The action of civil courts was invoked, and the officers enforcing the law were subjected to harassing litigation, and in many instances fines were imposed upon them for acts done in their official capacity pursuant to the orders of superior and competent authority. Notwithstanding these difficulties, the duty was satisfactorily discharged. When the Bureau was organized, the strength of the Army was deemed insufficient for offensive operations. The inadequacy of the system of recruiting previously pursued had been demonstrated. A new system was therefore inaugurated by the General Government, assuming the business which had previously been transacted mainly by the State governments. The functionaries provided by the enrollment law were made United States recruiting officers, springing directly from the people, and at the same time exercising the authority and representing the necessities and wishes of the government. They reached the masses and were able, without abating the requirements of the conscription, to promote volunteering and to forward recruits as fast as they could be obtained. The quotas of districts were made known. Each locality was advised of the number it was required to furnish, and that in event of failure the draft would follow. The result was that 1,120,621 men were raised at an average cost on account of recruitment exclusive of bounties of $9.84 per man, while the cost of recruiting the 1,356,593 raised prior to the organization of the Bureau was $34.01 per man. In addition to the duties of recruitment, the law required the provost marshal to arrest deserters wherever they might be found, and 76,526 were arrested and returned to the ranks. The provost marshal general compared, for the purpose of great wars, the system of recruitment by volunteer enlistment stimulated by bounties with the system of compulsory service through enrollment of the national forces by the direct action of the general government and their draft if volunteering failed. He said that a plan of recruitment based upon the bounty system will necessarily be more expensive than any other, and as a rule produce soldiers of an inferior class. And although bounty is unquestionably calculated to stimulate recruiting, it does not always accomplish that object at the proper time. For when it is visible, as it was during the late war, that in the anxiety to obtain recruits the bounties offered constantly increased, the men who intend to enlist at one time or another are induced to hold back with the hope at a later day of receiving higher compensation and having to serve for a shorter period. In time of peace, enough recruits to meet the requirements of the service can usually be procured without the aid of bounty, and in time of war the country can least afford the cost, besides needing the service of better men than those who enter the army simply from mercenary motives. The Provost Marshal General regarded the Enrollment Act of 1863 and its amendments, with some slight improvements which he suggested, as establishing a military system adequate to any emergency which the country is ever likely to encounter. Under the wise and patient guidance of President Lincoln, the delicate duties of this bureau, novel to our country and possessed of almost unlimited powers, were successfully performed, the rights of citizens duly considered, and personal liberty always respected. The careful attention which the President himself gave to the complicated and vexatious business of enrollment and draft is indicated by the report of a committee appointed by the Legislature of Rhode Island to confer with him concerning the quota of that State. The committee said, the President at this point interrupted the committee to say that complaints from several States had already been made to the same effect, and in one instance the subject had been so earnestly pressed upon his attention that he had personally taken the pains to examine for himself the formula which the Provost Marshal General had adopted for the calculation and distribution of the quota for the different States, and had arrived at the conclusion that it was impossible for any candid mind to doubt or question its entire fairness. The President further stated that the plan that had been adopted by the Provost Marshal General for the assignment of the respective quotas met his entire approval and appeared to him to be the only one by which exact justice could be secured. While the controversy between the government and its opponents in regard to the enrollment and the draft was going on, the President, disappointed and grieved at the persistent misrepresentations of his views and his intentions by those of whom he thought better things were to be expected, feeling that he was unable by the power of logic or persuasion to induce the leaders of the Democratic party to do him justice or to cooperate with him in the measures which he was convinced were for the public good, thought for a time of appealing directly to the people of the United States in defense of the conduct of the government. He prepared a long and elaborate address, which he intended most especially for the consideration of the honest and patriotic Democrats of the North, setting forth with his inimitable clearness of statement the necessity of the draft, the substantial fairness of its provisions, and the honesty and the equity with which, as he claimed, the government had attempted to carry it out. But after he had finished it, doubts arose in his mind as to the propriety or expediency of addressing the public directly in that manner, and it was never published. It is for the first time printed in this work, and from Mr. Lincoln's own manuscript, and it is a question whether whether the reader will more admire the lucidity and the fairness with which the President sets forth his views, or the reserve and abnegation with which, after writing it, he resolved to suppress so admirable a paper. It is at all times proper that misunderstanding between the public and the public servant should be avoided. And this is far more important now than in times of peace and tranquillity. I therefore address you without searching for a precedent upon which to do so. Some of you are sincerely devoted to the republican institutions and territorial integrity of our country, and yet are opposed to what is called the draft, or conscription. At the beginning of the war, and ever since, a variety of motives, pressing, some in one direction and some in the other, would be presented to the mind of each man physically fit for a soldier, upon the combined effect of which motives he would or would not voluntarily enter the service. Among these motives would be patriotism, political bias, ambition, personal courage, love of adventure, want of employment, and convenience, or the opposite of some of these. We already have and have had in the service, as appears, substantially all that can be obtained upon this voluntary weighing of motives, and yet we must somehow obtain more, or relinquish the original object of the contest, together with all the blood and treasure already expended in the effort to secure it. To meet this necessity, the law for the draft has been enacted. You who do not wish to be soldiers do not like this law. This is natural, nor does it imply want of patriotism. Nothing can be so just and necessary as to make us like it if it is disagreeable to us. We are prone, too, to find false arguments with which to excuse ourselves for opposing such disagreeable things. In this case, those who desire the rebellion to succeed, and others who seek reward in a different way, are very active in accommodating us with this class of arguments. They tell us the law is unconstitutional. It is the first instance, I believe, in which the power of Congress to do a thing has ever been questioned in a case when the power is given by the Constitution in express terms. Whether a power can be implied when it is not expressed has often been the subject of controversy, but this is the first case in which the degree of effrontery has been ventured upon of denying a power which is plainly and distinctly written down in the Constitution. The Constitution declares that the Congress shall have power to raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years. The whole scope of the Conscription Act is to raise and support armies. There is nothing else in it. It makes no appropriation of money, and hence the money clause just quoted is not touched by it. The case simply is, the Constitution provides that the Congress shall have power to raise and support armies, and by this act the Congress has exercised the power to raise and support armies. This is the whole of it. It is a law made in literal pursuance of this part of the United States Constitution. And another part of the same Constitution declares that this Constitution and the laws made in pursuance thereof shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. Do you admit that the power is given to raise and support armies, and yet insist by this act Congress has not exercised the power in a constitutional mode, has not done the thing in the right way? Who is to judge of this? The Constitution gives Congress the power, but it does not prescribe the mode, or expressly declare who shall prescribe it. In such case, Congress must prescribe the mode or relinquish the power. There is no alternative. Congress could not exercise the power to do the thing if it had not the power of providing a way to do it, when no way is provided by the Constitution for doing it. In fact, Congress would not have the power to raise and support armies if even by the Constitution it were left to the option of any other or others to give or withhold the only mode of doing it. If the Constitution had prescribed a mode, Congress could and must follow that mode, but as it is, the mode necessarily goes to Congress, with the power expressly given. The power is given fully, completely, unconditionally. It is not a power to raise armies if state authorities consent, nor if the men to compose the armies are entirely willing, but it is a power to raise and support armies given to Congress by the Constitution without an if. It is clear that a constitutional law may not be expedient or proper. Such would be a law to raise armies when no armies were needed. But this is not such. The republican institutions and territorial integrity of our country cannot be maintained without the further raising and supporting of armies. There can be no army without men. Men can be had only voluntarily or involuntarily. We have ceased to obtain them voluntarily, and to obtain them involuntarily is the draft, the conscription. If you dispute the fact and declare that men can still be had voluntarily in sufficient numbers, prove the assertion by yourselves volunteering in such numbers, and I shall gladly give up the draft. Or if not a sufficient number, but any one of you will volunteer, he for his single self will escape all the horrors of the draft, and will thereby do only what each one of at least 1,000,000 of his manly brethren have already done. Their toil and blood have been given, as much for you as for themselves. Shall it all be lost, rather than that you too will bear your part? I do not say that all who would avoid serving in the war are unpatriotic, but I do think every patriot should willingly take his chance under a law made with great care in order to secure entire fairness. This law was considered, discussed, modified, and amended by Congress at great length and with much labor, and was finally passed by both branches with a near approach to unanimity. At last, it may not be exactly such as any one man out of Congress or even in Congress would have made it. It has been said, and I believe truly, that the Constitution itself is not altogether such as any one of its framers would have preferred. It was the joint work of all, and certainly the better that it was so. Much complaint is made of that provision of the conscription law which allows a drafted man to substitute $300 for himself, while, as I believe, none is made of that provision which allows him to substitute another man for himself. Nor is the $300 provision objected to for unconstitutionality, but for inequality, for favoring the rich against the poor. The substitution of men is the provision, if any, which favors the rich to the exclusion of the poor. But this being a provision in accordance with an old and well-known practice in the raising of armies is not objected to. There would have been great objection if that provision had been omitted. And yet, being in, the money provision really modifies the inequality which the other introduces. It allows men to escape the service who are too poor to escape but for it. Without the money provision, competition among the more wealthy might, and probably would, raise the price of substitutes above $300, thus leaving the man who could raise only $300 no escape from personal service. True, by the law as it is, the man who cannot raise so much as $300, nor obtain a personal substitute for less, cannot escape, but he can come quite as near escaping as he could if the money provision were not in the law. To put it another way, is an unobjectionable law, which allows only the man to escape who can pay $1,000, made objectionable by adding a provision that any one may escape who can pay the smaller sum of $300? This is the exact difference at this point between the present law and all former draft laws. It is true that by this law a somewhat larger number will escape than could under a law allowing personal substitutes only, but each additional man thus escaping will be a poorer man than could have escaped by the law in the other form. The money provision enlarges the class of exempts from actual service simply by admitting poorer men into it. How then can the money provision be a wrong to the poor man? The inequality complained of pertains in greater degree to the substitution of men, and is really modified and lessened by the money provision. The inequality could only be perfectly cured by sweeping both provisions away. This, being a great innovation, would probably leave the law more distasteful than it now is. The principle of the draft, which simply is involuntary or enforced service, is not new. It has been practiced in all ages of the world. It was well known to the framers of our Constitution as one of the modes of raising armies. At the time they placed in that instrument the provision that the Congress shall have power to raise and support armies. It had been used just before in establishing our independence, and it was also used under the Constitution in 1812. Wherein is the peculiar hardship now? Shall we shrink from the necessary means to maintain our free government, which our grandfathers employed to establish it, and our own fathers have already employed once to maintain it? Are we degenerate? Has the manhood of our race run out? Again, a law may be both constitutional and expedient, and yet may be administered in an unjust and unfair way. This law belongs to a class, which class is composed of those laws whose object is to distribute burthens or benefits on the principle of equality. No one of these laws can ever be practically administered with that exactness which can be conceived of in the mind. A tax law, the principle of which is that each owner shall pay in proportion to the value of his property, will be a dead letter if no one can be compelled to pay until it can be shown that every other one will pay in precisely the same proportion according to value. Nay, even it will be a dead letter if no one can be compelled to pay until it is certain that every other one will pay at all, even in unequal proportion. Again, the United States House of Representatives is constituted on the principle that each member is sent by the same number of people that each other one is sent by, and yet in practice no two of the whole number, much less the whole number, are ever sent by precisely the same number of constituents. The districts cannot be made precisely equal in population at first, and if they could, they would become unequal in a single day, and much more so in the 10 years which the districts once made are to continue. They cannot be remodeled every day, nor without too much expense and labor even every year. This sort of difficulty applies in full force to the practical administration of the draft law. In fact, the difficulty is greater in the case of the draft law. First, it starts with all the inequality of the congressional districts, but these are based on entire population, while the draft is based upon those only who are fit for soldiers, and such may not bear the same proportion to the whole in one district that they do in another. Again, the facts must be ascertained, and credit given for the unequal numbers of soldiers which have already gone from the several districts. In all these points errors will occur in spite of the utmost fidelity. The government is bound to administer the law with such an approach to exactness as is usual in analogous cases, and as entire good faith and fidelity will reach. If so great departures as to be inconsistent with such good faith and fidelity, or great departures occurring in any way be pointed out, they shall be corrected, and any agent shown to have caused such departures intentionally shall be dismissed. With these views and on these principles, I feel bound to tell you it is my purpose to see the draft law faithfully executed. End of Chapter 2.